Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Hydragons Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another Archon's Archive. Today we are going over Chaos Worlds, and specifically this is a part 1. We will be reviewing a video from Arch, formerly Warhammer, a fairly famous Warhammer YouTuber, and lore-tuber by extension. Now, this is a soft part 1. Those of you seeing this as it comes up will note that it is a members-only video. We will explain why that is at the end of said video, but it will be released to the masses at a second period of time. In addition, it is a soft part 1 because you do not need to have watched part 1 to understand the part 2, which will be coming out to everyone within the next couple of days, possibly up to 4 days when this comes out for members. Now, this is going to be part review of Arch's video on Chaos Civilians and Chaos Worlds, and it will be part Mythos cleanup. Now, why do I say Mythos cleanup? Specifically for these reasons. We need to address some stuff when we go over this. One, this is a review. This is not a critique. I am not making value judgments on someone else's work. I will almost never do that unless it's, come swing at me first, then I will gladly come back at you, though even then I often don't bother with it. But this is a review. I am looking at a piece of media, I am attempting to interpret or reinterpret the most important pieces of said media in my own lens. Now, why my own lens? Because, similar to Arch, there's a reason why I say the things that I do. Now, for him, this Chaos video, which is around 35 minutes long, we won't be watching the whole thing, we'll be watching several large sections and then reviewing them. This was an introduction to his Civilians pairing, so you'll notice which one is more important. The Chaos Civilians section got about 35 minutes in the video. That's a sizable video, but in comparison to the Imperial Civilians video, which is an hour and 17 minutes, it's pretty obvious which one was going to be the focus. And again, that's perfectly reasonable. I have no problem with that. So why then is this such a theory-heavy or interpretation-heavy video? Why did I feel the need to include somebody else's content instead of just making something for myself? Well, this is an interpretive thing. This is interpretation because lore is both contradictory and incredibly niche on this subject. So, anything essentially goes as far as how you want to take the disparate information we have and then interpret it to form consistent themes and theories that will tie together and link several different disparate pieces of information. It would be as if you were reading an alphabetic chart or something of that nature, but every third or fourth letter, it not only changed what the cipher was, but also how much information you got with it. That naturally lends itself to needing to fill in the gaps. Now, you can look at filling in these gaps in, I would argue, 3 total or averaged ways. One, you can look at them through the Imperial lens, which, in my opinion, is how Arch, formerly Warhammer Arch, looks at Chaos Worlds. He looks at them through the Imperial lens, aka if an Imperial official, naturally his persona is an Inquisitor. Mine is a Chaos demagogue, so of course we have different views on Chaos, but he views it from the Imperial lens, assuming that the Chaos Gods and chaotic society is being perceived from an Imperial's point of view. Somebody who naturally has grown up, been bred, and been taught that Chaos is anathema to both mankind and to, essentially, the Emperor, to society and civilization. Now, he goes into several details of why he believes these things, and I'll be looking at it from the other side of the curtain, essentially. The chaotic lens. That's how the Archon, myself, how I'm going to be looking at his video, and how I'm going to be interpreting the lore on Chaos Worlds writ large when I do my part 2 video. And then finally, the neutral lens. While the neutral lens sure does sound like a good thing, this is how GW looks at Chaos lore, which essentially isn't neutral. It's variable. It means that whatever author at the time is writing the chaotic world, or the chaotic force that controls a world, that's going to heavily color how we interpret that lore. So, for example, the Word-Bearers writers, people who write for the Word-Bearers, perhaps somebody else, like Aaron Dembski-Bowden, could look at a chaotic world or need to write in a cult into their story, and it could either be the focus or it could be ancillary, and they want to throw in a bit of flavor. Say perhaps that there are rivers of blood on their Chaos world. Well, that's a lovely piece of flavor for them, but that author never has to revisit where all that blood came from. That author never has to explain how that came to be, and that author never really gets held with their feet to the fire to explain the lore blurbs that they write. Now, we have several wonderful exceptions to this rule, one of the absolute best being Dan Abnett, of course, who I will constantly glaze for, giving me an existence and making me love this setting so much. But that means variable. You're going to have your Dan Abnetts, you're going to have your Aaron Dembski-Bowdens, you're going to have all these different levels of author. Not a negative to either of them. They do some things well, they do some things absolutely terribly. But it does mean that GW's lore is, if anything, inconsistent. So, while we may look at things with different lenses, we are also limited in how the actual canon looks at lore. So, all of the above lenses being valid for their various reasons, let's go through most of this video. I'll point out some things that I disagree with. I'll provide evidence or logical conclusions to try and explain my position on them, and we'll be jumping back and forth through this presentation as we go. So, let us start out, and I promise we'll be doing backs and forths.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Where today we are going to talk about life on a chaos-controlled planet. Or more specifically, what it's like to just be a regular citizen on a world owned by the ruinous powers. And we will primarily be talking about worlds ruled by other Chaos cultists, or Chaos Space Marines at worst, because, well, demon worlds in the Eye of Terror? Whilst there are worlds in the Eye of Terror that possess human populations, they're not so much living on them as briefly existing, until they are caught and brutally murdered to death by some horned monster. At the absolute best, the life for a human in the Eye of Terror would be as a slave. At least then you would have the protection of being property. And hopefully, whatever force owns you is able and willing to protect you at least up until the point where you remain useful. Slaving away in the salt mines. Hey, you're gonna die there too from exhaustion or being whipped to death by brutal overlords, but your odds of survival are still significantly higher than out in the wild, where you're probably just going to be used for sport or ritual material. Now, there are some sort of kind of cushier jobs, like providing food for some of the more civilized Chaos worlds, like Medrengard, for example, which is owned and run by a Petarabo, where hundreds of Chaos Iron Warrior warbands...
Alright, so there's our first section. Let's go down to the first problem that I have with this whole video. 2 minutes. Conflation. Conflation of Chaos world types is a primary issue that I have with this video. One of the ones that I'm like, I really see this being a problem, especially in our future interpretations. You'll see how this builds throughout the video. I'm only going really in depth for the first half of it, but this conflation is the first kind of stumbling block. We are just starting, and already we've reached a major stumbling point. How do we define chaotic control of a world? How do we define it? How do we separate it? And how do we put things from one type of chaos world into another? Well, I would give a clear example for this. I break it down into essentially clearer distinctions. You have demon worlds. Demon worlds are inside of the warp. They are either subsumed, aka they have been consumed by the warp, a warp rift, or the Eye of Terror, or some split, or the Maelstrom, or, great psychic powers, a Gehemenet Tower, whatever it is, or Magnus, sucks a planet beyond the firmament, out of real space, into the warp. That's subsumed worlds. More common, however, are true demon worlds. These are planets that are created essentially at the whim of the Chaos Gods, or by the will of demon princes. Again, technically in collusion with their god. So, there are the worlds in the warp. You have demon worlds and you have subsumed worlds. Then you have what I like to call traditional chaos worlds. In my opinion, these are some of the most interesting as they offer us the most unpolluted or pure form of human chaos worship. They are planets that have had chaos as their primary theology for their entire existence, or for long enough that it has become standard operating procedure within their society. Now, you might say, what kind of world is that has been untouched by the Imperium? Well, it's not necessarily that it's been untouched by the Imperium. It might be that it is so far away or so isolated that it has not been interacted with in a very long period of time. Examples of this are Colchis, which had a primary chaotic religion as its primary theology. Another example is Gura in one section of the Sanguinary Worlds, and we'll be talking about Gura at length here. Another good example is OG Cadia, back when Cadia was bathed in the Eye of the Warp and it was at the very far edge of the Imperial Great Crusade. Well, they too had a very chaotic religious system put in place. These traditional chaos worlds know nothing of the God Emperor, or if they know of him, it is merely as another deity or another form of deity or religion that they may choose to follow or take pieces of. These traditional chaos worlds are not, very importantly, not in the warp, nor were they originally imperial. So the final version is captured Imperial worlds. This is worlds that were Imperial, worship the God Emperor, all of that good stuff, and some external force of chaos influenced them or took them over or outright conquered them, and they have now been set up as ruled by the ruinous powers, by the Chaos Gods and their followers. Now, with that explained, the problem with this premise, the conflation issue that I have, is that it creates problems later. So, when Arch is going to say things like, such and such a thing happens on Chaos Worlds, or on Demon Worlds, or on Chaos-held worlds, sometimes he means demon worlds, sometimes he means traditional chaos worlds, and sometimes captured, or he could mean all of them altogether. This becomes very challenging when you're trying to reference what he's trying to justify, right? Because not everything is going to fly on every single type of world. It is a primary issue that we try and demystify this conflation, because the difference between a traditional chaos world and a captured chaos world are night and day. They're so completely different that they would be absolutely unrecognizable, even to a chaos worshipper, much of the time. Demon worlds are equally unrecognizable. We're talking about a place where the laws of physics and reality basically need not apply most of the time, and human beings are a function of the planet, like air and gravity and magnetism are. They are accounted for where they do for exist, but we'll get to that in a bit. Let's get back to the video at 2 minutes. Sorry, I am going to have to jump back and forth. There we go.
Iron warrior warbands each build their very own fortress and then engage in games of aggressive Minecraft with one another, sieging that fortress before falling back to defend their own, and so on. But again, for the overwhelming majority of the time, living on a demon world isn't really living at all. Hey, you might actually get lucky and get Nurgle. At least that way you'll slowly die of a disease rather than being torn apart by a demon vulture. So, we'll mostly skip over the demon world segment and get to what it's like living on a world in real space. As, of course, Chaos owns and operates entire independent empires of their own. Nothing to rival the sheer scope and scale of the Imperium of Man, of course, but still significant holdings, often numbering dozens upon dozens of worlds and solar systems. We covered, of course, a major Chaos Empire in the War for the Sabbat Worlds series, where the forces of the Imperium were opposed by the Blood Pact, and preceding that as well, a series of Chaos Warlords that ruled over the Sanguinary Worlds. Now, The most basic level of existence, then, for a civilian on a chaos-held world, is simply that of tribal barbarian, which is what the sanguinary worlds are primarily...
Alright, let's pause right there and go 2 slides down. He has a very good point here, but we have a bit of a glaring issue that's starting to develop, and it's going to continue developing. The claim. He's focusing upon trad worlds. That's what he's going towards. He wants to look at those traditional chaos worlds, places like Gora, and then, in addition, captured worlds. So, he's focusing on trad world to the exclusion, or again, the theoretical conflation of demon or captured world. So we know what he wants to look at, and then we know that he maybe is a little bit fuzzy on where he's drawing the line as to what type of world he's looking at. This gets considerably worse when we look at what he states as the standard lifestyle for the average chaos worshipper on a trad planet. Now, it's a good point to say that many demon worlds, even if they serve a purpose, don't necessarily require or sustain a permanent population. It could be temporary, it could be vacillating, it could be drastically increasing or decreasing over time. It just depends on what the world is for, because again, most of them are for something. This is a reason to look at real space, your captured worlds, and your traditional chaos worlds. Sure. However, big glaring issue, that is ignoring the fact that there are, in fact, many important worlds in the warp that both sustain life and are in active use and active chaotic possession, so to speak. So, he makes a good point in that that's a reason why we should focus on real space, focus on the traditional worlds and the captured worlds, but he misses the whole point of sustainment within the warp itself. The fact that chaos isn't just automatically ruling out any chance that there's people on a demon world. Matter of fact, large numbers of well-organized and well-sustained and supplied people. We're going to be getting into that in detail both in this video and the next, but opening up this can of worms is going to be a little bit of an issue in the future. So, what would I adjust about this? Basically, if he's making that claim that that's what we're focusing on and that's what we're avoiding, I would say one important thing. Well, symbiosis of chaos humanity within the warp isn't just possible. It's actually logically consistent depending upon the world. If the object of a planet's creation, existence, subsumption, whatever it needs to be, is anything other than absolute and utter destruction and consumption, which, by the way, can be done in real space. There's no need for a demon prince to transit his world into the warp if he just intends to clear it of all life and send all those souls to the gods. No point in transiting it to the warp. He can do that himself in real space. Same thing applies with Chaos Worshippers as well. Why build a Gehemenet tower and cause millions of people to die, or billions of people to die, when you could just do it in real space? There is usually an object when you move a planet into warp space or when the gods create a planet for one of their chosen followers, be it a prince, demon primarch, forge world that happens to co-opt a chaotic demon world, whatever it happens to be. So, even worlds consumed by princes, like the most violent of vile, the most independent of the gods who may naturally have an overarching goal for a planet, even the ones consumed by princes have an ecosystem. Now, I put ecosystem in quotes there because it's a little bit rough on how exactly humans are supposed to fit into this ecosystem. And I would say that any ecosystem basically requires that you have access to things that you need to live. We're going to be talking about what exactly that is, how it might be accomplished, but here's some good examples of some of those worlds in which there is a permanent, reliable, and purpose-driven human population that lives within the warp, or is affected directly by chaotic forces. In terms of ones that are directly in the warp, we have Galmech and Sortiarius. Galmech and Sortiarius are both worlds with large amounts of factories. In the case of Galmech, it's basically a forge world. In the case of Sortiarius, it is a planet that should not sustain a population, and yet it does. And it has factories in addition to that. It is where the Thousand Suns keep their current homeworld, and it has been brought into the warp and then back out of the warp more than once, essentially. So it is transited into and out of real space. Now, those two are both great examples of planets that need to sustain a population on a planet that can't naturally sustain it. And this is specifically cited on Sortiarius. It mentions that the physical realm, the existence of the darn place, the ability for it to sustain food and life and a population is non-existent. And yet the population is there, and well enough, and healthy enough, and large enough to produce weapons in factories and to maintain supply lines, logistics, train troops and soldiers, etc. So there is something clearly showing that in spite of the lack of natural amenities for mankind within the warp, it's clear that Chaos has found a way to keep these people alive in vast numbers in order to utilize their labor, their worship, etc. The last example is Vergast. Now, Vergast specifically is an example of how a captured world or a trad world can essentially cross over. You can have a chaotic dart in the heart of Imperial space, a symbiosis not just between the warp, chaotic worshippers, and real space, but also between Imperial worlds and the theoretical, logistical, and military clockwork of Chaos forces. In that case, it's Inheritor Asphodel taking over a hive on an Imperial world and using it as a base with nobody being the wiser. Now, that also is an extent, and it's a great book, Necropolis, that's certainly worth a read if you're interested in Chaos lore and logistics, but Vergast is another example of the idea that, well, the warp and also Chaos are not just completely incompatible with a functioning civilization with a high population that can sustain itself. So, let's go back. And it is minute 350. Yeah.
Armies of the Gaur, once he eventually arose.
Gonna back up just a few seconds because I need to talk about what he just said.
In essence, nevertheless, which is why the introduction of the Blood Pact was such a massive revolution to the armies of the Gaur, once he eventually rose to power. But before wandering too far off the point, the base existence is that of a simple tribal civilian, a hunter-gatherer, or maybe in a more settled society that of a farmer, or potentially a raider or a warrior. These people will live relatively normal lives. They won't even understand why the life they live is somehow wrong or terrible, even if they are in direct service to the Chaos Gods. Now, a bit of a subgenre of this might be a world where the population lives in essence, slavery to the Chaos Gods, but they don't know it. As Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh have many sub-deities with which they attempt to trick people into worshipping them, but via a proxy. But again, that's not really a chaos-held world per se, so I'm just mentioning that for argument's sake. But if you've lived your entire life on a world where Khorne is the dominant religion, you will see nothing wrong with the idea of going raiding every summer, attacking neighboring communities and dragging them back home and sacrificing them on iron altars. That is simply what you have done your whole life. It is simply what you have known and experienced for your whole life. And there will be various local traditions and justifications for this. A la the Vikings, which did it because they were poor and realized that other people in other places had a lot more stuff than them, or arguments over territory, or simply for religious reasons. We happen to worship a god that really likes blood, and so we're gonna go over there and hit you over the head with an axe.
Alrighty, so let's talk about some very specific problems, a series of issues that start at this point, and then go on to a more broad issue of conflating old world and new world lore, or, well, I won't be that unkind. I'll say interesting interpretations of feudal society in Chaos Worlds. One, just to get some quick things out of the way, the Gower, specifically Urlach Gower, but previous Gowers before him, is the traditional head of the martial priesthood that is known as the Blood Pact on Gora. They are, at the beginning of the Crusade, and have been, his traditional force of martial barbarians, if you'd like to call them that. They are a martial priesthood, to be specific, and their tribal society is actually a good example of how the constant cycle he's about to describe will often come to a more permanent end. We'll get to that in a bit, but I just wanted to make it clear. The way he describes the Gower and the introduction of the Blood Pact is not accurate whatsoever. That is, I think, a little bit of a slip on his part, because I know he's smart enough to not conflate those things intentionally. He might be a little bit topsy-turvy on that, but the Gower did not bring the Blood Pact in. The Gower is their traditional head. He is the head of the martial priesthood. They are his personal bodyguards after he unites all of Gura. So, again, just little pet peeve there. 2, the quote, won't understand why the life they live is so wrong or terrible. 2 important points. 1, who says that the life is terrible for them? In their culture, with their traditions, assuming we're talking about traditional chaos, life might be pretty darn good for them. And just assuming that it's terrible and assuming that they're unhappy with that life, or presuming that they're, ignorant babes in the woods too stupid to understand what good and evil or bad and not so bad is, especially when it comes to their own existence, we can't cut off humanity from these people. An understanding of what is good for me versus what is good for society doesn't just change because of, I don't know, what I happen to be doing that day. If I have an understanding of things in my culture being right or wrong, if I'm living my life to the fullest of what my culture allows, then that is a good life. Now, if I were to compare it to external forces, we're no longer talking about a traditional chaos world, right? So, for example, if a Goran savage, one of the early Blood Pact troops, finds himself on a hive world, and he tries to get into a 9-to-5 job to understand what it is that these Imperials do, how they live, he would likely be incredibly miserable, hate his life, and think that this is a terrible way to live, in comparison to the way that he used to. The freedom, in comparison, is dramatically reduced when part of a different culture. It's all about perspective here. I just want to point that out. One man's horrible way of living is another man's traditional way of having a great time. Now, moral judgments aside, it's not exactly like the Imperium nor the Chaos Gods really have much to stand on when it comes to moral purity or aspects of beneficial kindness, but we'll talk about that later when it comes to idealism. Great quote there. 2, the concept of slavery, specifically, is taken at face value here, as is the concept of deception. These are concepts that might be totally non-applicable to worlds like Gura, Colchis, or OG Cadia, places where chaos was the theological root of society, and they actually had a functioning or even a flourishing social culture and personal history and system of ethics and morals and just a society in general that calling them slaves or deceived or deluded would be completely out of position for anyone taking an actual look at what they had built on that world with that theological system. Now, of course, you could make plenty of arguments, again, moral relativism aware, but to call them outright enslaved, depending on whether we're talking about traditional chaos worlds, this is again where that idea of conflation becomes a very, very bad pitfall. Because if you look at some worlds, yes, slavery is absolutely an accurate term. If you look at other worlds, deception might be a loosely accurate term. But if you look at places that are traditional chaos worlds, if you look at places that are demon worlds, most of those are going to be absolutely non-applicable when it comes to the terms slavery or deception. They understand what they're doing, and society is generally geared towards doing it as best you can. 3, deceptive god worship actually is going to be as likely, if not more likely, on captured worlds than on traditional worlds, especially due to the subversive activity of cults. So, for example, when we talk about deceptive god worship, the idea that we're worshiping an aspect of the god emperor, or an aspect of Khorne, that is going to be something that's more common on an Imperial world. Why would it be more common on an Imperial world than on a traditional Chaos world? Well, I do admit that you might have traditional Chaos worlds that worship, say, Karnath, or Nergal, or Slaanet, or some sort of off-slurred version of the god's name, they are much more straight up when it comes to the things that that god tends to like, enjoy, and value. Now, if you consider that deceptive god worship just because we're using a different name, sure. What I consider deceptive god worship is where you take a local imperial saint or an aspect of the god emperor and you twist it into becoming subversive worship of a chaos god. So, for example, the Golden Warrior, a concept where you take the image of the Golden Emperor or a Space Marine chapter and you value things about it that vibe with the concept of worshipping Khorne. In this way, you have deceptively convinced a large number of people to levy their worship towards Khorne rather than the God Emperor. So that is what I would call deceptive god worship, and that is dramatically more common on captured worlds or occupied worlds than it would be on traditional worlds where there's no need for that level of separation and deception. We can worship the gods outright if we have some understanding of the warp, and even if we don't, we can still substitute names when we don't necessarily have direct connection. 4. It should go without saying that if you are on a world that worships an aspect of a chaos god, no matter how distant it is from the actual chaos god, and this is a universally accepted religion, you are on a chaos-held world. Once again, see Cultus, see OG Cadia. These are places that may not have understood the entirety of the picture as far as chaos worship goes, but if you're summoning demons and calling them demons of Slanet instead of demons of Slaanesh, or even if you're worshipping the bloody god, and it's like the bloody god emperor, but yeah, it's still just an aspect of Khorne, you've been tricked into it, that is definitely a chaos-held world. And I think my justification for saying that would be, if you were an Inquisitor and you dropped down on a planet that worshipped the bloody god emperor and everyone's running around chopping heads off and putting them on statues of the god emperor, I think we would probably be glassing that planet from orbit, if not just killing everyone. So I would say that it's chaos held at that point. Whether chaos is making use of it, that is entirely unrelated to how you would designate that planet as an Inquisitor. 5. Let's talk sacrifices real quick. We're going to get into further details with it later, but human history, and yes, we can look at humans in 40k as mentally and socially analogous to humans in our past, because that is how they are portrayed. Even if they're not biologically, genetically, whatever, exactly the same as modern anatomical humans, they are portrayed as sharing similar social and mental capabilities to us. Human history is a history of constant warfare. So the above details and chaos being infused into a conflict basically leads into the following. What I refer to as the flaw of the Norska parallel, or basically society versus quote-unquote society. Now, the claim or issue here is that society, if organized under chaos, is always bad because chaos. The idea that if you formed something, if you created something that is considered a society, because you are chaos worshippers, it is inherently bad in some way. The assumption is that even in real space, chaos cannot be acceptable or hospitable. It can in no way be amenable to people. And this is a problem that I have because in the eyes of some individuals, and in fact some lore writers as well, no matter what you do, quote-unquote, just being chaos automatically submits your entire civilization to a death spiral in some manner, whether culturally with the breakup and infighting, technologically with the isolation and the backsliding, comfort-wise with everyone being miserable all the time, ethic and moral dubiousness where you're destroyed internally from utter decadence and destruction, or just pure moral degeneracy where everything in your society breaks apart because there is no trust foundation or hierarchy. Now, these are all based on the concept that human beings plus chaos automatically is going to create a bad society. It is based upon the premise that chaos cannot form the basis for a just, moral, comfortable, or just in any way good or acceptable society. AKA, it's gotta be bad just because chaos. That's the bad part. The central part of chaos is that it's bad. That's the point that we're going from here, right? With the Norska parallel, again, it's like, oh, these people are bad. Why? Because they're Norskans, because it's part of their society. They're just bad. Their culture's bad. The way that they set it up is bad. Everything that they do is bad, and they can never make anything good. The adjustment that I would make to this, and even though I will repeat again, not all of these are direct responses to Arch's video, some of them are just things that I've seen floating around that I really want to make comment on, like, there's some things that people really hold dear and solid. I don't know why they happen to do so. People are sometimes relatively close-minded when it comes to chaos, but, that's not really their fault. They've been propagandized into it a majority of the time. But consider external pressures. And this is just for a beginning. We will be going into much more when it comes to chaotic society, but consider external pressures. And, of course, how different the Norscan system, the farmer, raider, chosen, unenlightened scum model, the idea of that simple might makes right hierarchy, looks on other worlds. And of course, how it can evolve. Because one of the most important things about chaos that we need to remember is that it is more flexible and more progressive in terms of change than any other society in 40k. While many people have progress in terms of technology, not all of them have progress in terms of society. The people who paint chaos as a cyclical process or an infinitely repeating, snake eating its own tail process, vastly underestimate the human capability to build, create, sustain, and supply. And throughout time, mankind has proven to be very capable of developing significant civilizational and industrial complexity in relatively difficult circumstances. I mean, my God, we made it to the moon with enough, with barely the computing power that you use to run your iPhone, much less an Apple Watch or something like that. So the idea that the Norska parallel, the farmer, raider, chosen, scummy, unenlightened southerner, is going to be how every single chaotic society, or even every proto-society or trad society, is going to present itself, and of course if you left them for 1,000 years, how they would remain or how they would stay and replicate themselves, is very, very tenuous, and I would generally disagree with it, because that society is one that is unbound from previous organizations, unbound from generally external pressures, unless they are, of course, engaged with the Imperium or engaged with other chaotic forces, and if left to their own devices, much of the time, they will self-develop and evolve. Another good thing to bring into this is a farmer versus a farmer. Essentially, parallel hierarchies. If you have a farmer in the Imperium, and we're going to go into this later when it comes to actual hierarchies and power levels and things like that, a farmer in the Imperium is one thing, but what is a farmer in Chaos? Someone who has the ability to produce for themselves. The lowest class of society, or what I would argue is just above the lowest class in society, those individuals in the Imperium, they are infinite, and they are considered relatively valueless because the skills that they offer are relatively cheap and available. In Chaos, however, that zooplankton, the lowest part on the totem pole, is incredibly important and must needs be protected, because without it, the entire ecosystem of a chaotic world, no matter what its type, will fall apart. Chaos worshippers need to eat like everyone else does. So the power of the farmer in Chaos is arguably better than that of the Imperial farmer. And of course, Arch goes into how this is not necessarily true, but we will get to that in time. I have just here wanting to explain that there is an importance to those lower classes that is not often ascribed to them, because we often get to see only the lower classes of the militarized force. The amount of chaos civilians that you've seen in any media whatsoever is so minuscule that I couldn't even explain it to you. Let me put it in this way. If it carries a gun, it's generally not a chaos civilian. But we'll get to that in another time. So, for example, if we look at the parallel hierarchies of real space worlds, if you look at cultists versus civilians, which we're going to do in part 2, there is an actual structural hierarchy here. Now, of course, might makes right. Why would there be a structural hierarchy if I can jump up it simply by killing the next person in line? And this is something that's brought up in the video, and it's something that I'd like to pour a little bit of cold water on and say, just wait on that one. Just wait on that one. We'll get to the hierarchies in a bit. We'll get to the examples of meritocracy and pseudo-meritocracy, how your use in society can improve your value. But I would also like to remind you that meritocracy in the Imperium is essentially or ostensibly non-existent. Now, service in exchange for advancement does exist. Having particular friends, organizations, time spent, threats to your life that you offer, such as joining up with the military, etc., those things can improve your lot in life in the Imperium. But if you are a farmer in Chaos, or if you are a farmer in the Imperium, the advancement available to you is very, very different. Now, again, that varies world to world. I'm simply giving examples of how this could be looked at with more nuance than just society bad because chaos. So some examples of organization on chaotic worlds are, well, let's start at the very top. If we're looking at true demon worlds, places created by the chaos gods to be inhabited by humans and to have an ecosystem that sustains them, or a legion that takes over a place and uses it for their nefarious purposes, well, that planet, and quite literally in this case, has a purpose. It was made for a purpose. It was effectively tailored or terraformed because the warp is literally able to manipulate reality on that world. If they want to make it so that it has half the gravity of any other planet, they absolutely can. If they want to make it so that it's constantly daylight, they absolutely can. If they want to make it so that the people there receive mass and consistent mutation, they absolutely can. We have examples of all of these. Sortiarius is a great example of this, with their various subspecies of Zangor, which are a self-supporting society or population, ostensibly drawn from a mix of locally reproducing individuals, usually humans, though oftentimes beastmen, and also a group of psychically attuned individuals who are of that species, Zangors specifically. That means that these planets have a reason to be, and that reason to be will be supported by the way that they are, physically, in the warp, terraformed almost, for mankind to exist on them. You know, in certain circumstances, it's considerably less conducive to life than in others, but I would say that certainly on some Prince or Legion worlds, it's not too bad. Now, on Prince or Legion or Prince or Elemental worlds, subsumed worlds where a planet has been dragged into the warp, you have a very different situation, but a very similar constitution. The prince can change the planet at will. In this case, it's not the purpose of the god or the purpose of the legion, the demon primarch, who is affecting the planet. It is the prince, or the elemental portion of his realm that has been granted to him by the gods. In such a way, he too has direct and complete control over that planet's quote-unquote habitability or functionality within the warp. Now, does that mean that he can spawn billions of lasguns out of thin air? No. But it does mean that creating an area where humans can labor, eat, feed, and create lasguns would certainly be possible. You can control the natural ecology, you can control and to some degree manipulate the population there, and gene alter or terraform them to the planet at the same time that you terraform the planet to them. It's a back and forth process, especially with princes that may want to often change the world that they're on to suit their various desires. Now, for trad worlds, you're looking at the traditional environment. The organization is going to be based on resource distribution, essentially. So, for example, on a planet like Gura, you might have a very limited amount of arable land, water, and metal. That means that the individuals who find nodules of such things, such as underground wells, portions of the ground rich in iron or meteoric residue, well, they're going to build structures and castles and fortresses on top of them. Now, in my mind, this looks very much like Afghanistan, with many mountain holdfasts and fortresses and wide, deep valleys across which many battles have been fought with primitive, feudal weapons over the thousands and thousands of years that they've been living here. But that doesn't mean that once chaos unites the world, whether it unites it under itself or unites it as a result of something external happening, those traditional environmental triggers, limitations, and hot points will remain. So, for example, if there was an iron mine or a wellspring near a certain mountain, that mountain is probably going to remain important to life on that planet. So it won't change much. Imperial pressure and resources are another important part, but specifically for captured worlds. Now, where resources are important in terms of their limitations for traditional worlds, resources that are produced are important for captured worlds. If you have a Forge world, it's going to be having very, very different society than an Agri world. If you're going to have a Hive world, it's going to have a different society and different pressures than, say, a Cemetery world. And of course, with captured worlds, there is the Imperial pressure. There is that external drive to, hey, any day now, a giant group of Imperial Guardsmen or Space Marines are going to come down and try and deal with this. This often leads to many captured worlds having to fend for themselves, and oftentimes you'll see that the awful things or the horrible evil badness that comes out of Chaos Worlds is actually brought on as a result of trying to protect oneself from Imperial retribution. So, all the privations of wartime certainly do apply to Chaos just as much as they apply to the Imperium. It's one of the reasons why Chaos has such a hard time, saving face or looking good in the Imperial eye, because, well, when you guys show up onto our worlds, we've been at a siege mentality for possibly decades, if not centuries. Now, if you're aware of what World War I did to Europe, I would like you to expand that to a continental scale, and then apply it to basically all of the captured Chaos worlds that you've ever seen. Without that external pressure, society would be completely different. I can guarantee that because we have examples of it. Again, Gura and Garyon being some of the absolute best, but that's enough of me jawing. Let's get back to Arch. So we were at 550. Let's jump.
Greetings and salutations, slight variations depending upon the god in question. A world that is ruled over by Nurgle, for example, would probably be a swampy, decaying hellhole, where the civilization, what little remains of it, is scattered across the planet so as to avoid spreading the countless poxes that ravage it constantly too quickly to one another. Or potentially they might even worship it and seek out other people in order to bless them. Now, the drawback with this system is, of course, that you're going to run out of people awfully quickly. So it's more likely that it'll be a worship of some specific mutation or ailment as a part of a religious rite, for example. Like eating a mushroom that makes you riotously ill to be given visions by the gods. A world owned by Slaanesh might simply be covered in hedonistic pleasure palaces, where the majority of the population slaves away to feed the excesses of a handful of nobles. Or on a Tzeentchian world, you might have a constant rise and fall of civilization, a constant revolving wheel of various ideologies or political ideas that make sure that no regime survives for too long. But again, from the perspective of a simple civilian, your life here will be relatively normal. There will be religious rites, and you do run the risk of getting sacrificed to one god or another if you end up at the bottom of the totem pole, absolutely. But short, brutal, subservient lives are pretty common in the Imperium, where you'll work away in some field or mine, if you're lucky.
Alright, let's talk Chaos, the Warp, demons, and people. This one will be relatively simple. The claim or the issue here at 735 is the warp and its effects, along with worshipping the gods, is inherently consumptive. It eats you up. It consumes everything. It is wasteful. It doesn't give anything back that can really be of use further down the line. And it's non-renewable, aka you will eventually run out. You will eventually always be consumed. All must be devoured. It's always going to take and take and take and never provide. And you can get stuck in this infinite cycle. This is along with the concept that the warp itself and the warping effects of chaos and demons are inherently hostile to humans and their everyday society. They're bad, guys. They're bad. They're always going to go kill you. They're always going to murder you. They're always out to get you. And oh my goodness, this is starting to sound very imperial now, isn't it? So, let's discuss nasty, brutish, and short. The old way of looking at human history. The idea that life was so terrible back in the day that human beings were just suffering until modern technology and enlightenment came along to improve their lives and make those brutish barbarians civilized men once more. I hate to be trite and unkind, but it bothers me when that is brought up in the context of chaos cultists in comparison to Imperials. Well, in this case, in addition to Imperials. But there are two sides to the nasty, brutish, and short argument. One, you have what's going on in the warp. First off, we've already gone over the idea that there has to be an ecosystem. Chaotic worlds in the warp, demon worlds, subsumed worlds, have a purpose. In order to complete that purpose, be it producing tanks or producing food, or even just entertaining the gods, you can't just murder everybody. There needs to be some level of reproduction occurring, even if it is artificial, that allows you to continue. Even on the most brutal and bloodthirsty feeding everyone into the Forge's world, Mendrengard, Korn's blood world where Tuska and his demon Wa ended up, there's still a process for repopulating that doesn't rely entirely upon external factors. Now, it could be cloning, it could be mass reproductive cycles where, okay, nobody dies for the next year, everybody gets it on, have 6 or 7 kids, and then we go and next 5 years, mass sacrifices, we make progress then, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. But the other important part is, demons, they're out to get ya. They're here to kill us all. You wander 2 feet off the reservation and they're gonna snap you up like a snack. We're in the warp, y'all. The demons are as powerful as they need to be on your world. And also, I'd like to add that whoever's in charge of your world, whatever god or whatever entity, has control over the planet, including the warp energy they're in, meaning that they can repel, attract, or adjust the habits of demons as they wish. But beyond even that most basic of details, I'd like to add in that there's a specific theory here. Demons in depth. Essentially, it's the idea that why don't cultists immediately get eaten by demons all the time? We know that they don't. That simply isn't the case. Now, demons certainly do have a proclivity for turning on humans that are either unprepared, unexpecting, or when the demons themselves are starved for energy, they may consume the lives of others. And of course, there is some stalking and hunting going on, perhaps in certain scenarios and environments where they've been allowed to do so. But let's be clear, if that was free everywhere all the time, none of these planets would be able to function whatsoever, period, end of story. The warp corruption in the warp would be so extraneous and so significant that no human would ever survive. So it brings in a specific paradigm. The idea of the black soul and the idea of demonic hunger. Now, from the outside, if I were to strip them to the skin, a chaos worshipper, a chaos cultist from Mendrengard, for example, and a imperial mutant may look no different to you or I. They may look exactly the same. It's like, okay, he's got mutations, he looks ragged and miserable, he looks ragged and miserable. But demons don't see the flesh. They don't care much about what we look like on the outside. It's what the soul looks like that matters to them. And the comparison between even an imperial mutant's soul and the soul of a true cultist is dramatic. And infectious and stained, and clearly differentiates the cultist from the non, clearly differentiates the branded and the affiliated and the aligned with the non. There is a delineation point here that I believe basically conveys significant protection onto the cultists, which is why they're able to operate in areas where demons roam freely or stalk freely, because if the demon does not hunger, which they do often coming out of the warp or in the upper levels of the warp, wherefore they float up in order to enter our reality or try and find slipways into our reality, they are hungry, they are starved, they are expending energy in order to exist. In the warp, they have all the energy that they need. Soul stuff is literally falling from the sky, and of course, the power of whatever spirit or creation is creating your world is naturally feeding the demon and allowing it to consistently exist. Therefore, they are not nearly as peckish as they would be coming into real space. Therefore, if they see an individual who is soul blackened, who is marked by the gods as theirs, who is owned essentially by the gods, whose soul has been ritually corrupted or purified, depending on your perspective, there's no need for them to go all that far in terms of devouring them. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not in danger. I certainly wouldn't go, have a nice brewski with demons, but I'm also going to say that there's not an incredibly high chance that if you're working on a demon world, some random bloodletter is just going to be stalking the halls, intentionally killing every human that they see. Because again, if they were, these worlds would never function. Ever. It would not be logistically nor logically consistent for them to remain if that level of brutality was present, because on some of these worlds, demons stalk constantly in large numbers, so it would not be reasonable to expect every single human who came into contact with them to just be messily butchered. Now, that is a specific theory. I think that it makes a lot of sense, but of course the alternative is nearly as acceptable. In extension, and to what I have mentioned before, genetic tampering and terraforming of worlds in the warp. Now, this goes back to Sortiarius, the idea that a species or a population group of humans will change over time in order to adapt to a demon world in the same way that humans adapt to worlds in real space. Now, we have plenty of examples of this. Many of the individuals who go into the warp for long periods of time have many of the same mutations. For example, long life, extremely long life in some cases, hundreds if not thousands of years. In other cases, we have examples of consistent or uniform mutations, whether it's becoming more beast-like, becoming more bestial, or even demonic in some cases. All of these are essentially genetic, quote-unquote, again using chaos corruption, transformations that the human will undergo in order to allow them to experience their world, to understand its ins and outs, to survive the fluctuations in the ecosystem, so to speak, and a natural, healthy breeding population, which almost all of these worlds will require, is going to naturally have a continuous variation in these genetic mutations. And the drift will be based upon what the world happens to be doing, needing, or behaving like in the moment. Secondly, and finally for the In the Warp worlds, we have terraforming. Again, Sortiarius comes up here. It is a planet that is not able to sustain even the most simplistic of plant life. And yet, a large portion of mortal creatures that need to eat and need to consume food and water in order to live exist upon the planet, large enough to run massive factories and also raise small armies of their own. This is not something that is essentially viable to support with just occasional deliveries of food or raiding supplies. This needs some sort of warp terraforming in order to make possible. Now, it may be as simple as all of the cultists are fed nutrient paste or gruel, and this is generated from some sort of chaotic artifact. It may be something as complicated as a very complex recycling system for bodies, for chemicals, for off-gassing. Every oil or skin pigment or hair that drops off of your body is collected and then refined into nutrients that you then intake. But in any case, it shows examples of the warp being manipulated, either purposely or by the gods themselves, in order to keep a human population alive, because without it, these demon worlds would not be able to function and complete the task that the gods or their controllers have set up for them. Now, onto real space, this is where it gets really, really thorny. This is a heavy spectrum. There are massive ups and downs. Again, demons are a massive wildcard. Sometimes they stalk freely and they will, again, ignore the black-souled cultist, and then other times they will be ravenous, they will be hungry, they'll be starving, they'll be stalking the woods and devouring people. Or you might have situations where, again, terraforming is occurring, or mutation is occurring. Perhaps a cult or a group in real space prefers mutants. A Zechian cult, for example, that wants only beastmen in their ranks. So they recruit beastmen and they breed beastmen and they encourage their elevation in society to the point where beastmen are on top and normal humans are considered lower class. As a result, the population of beastmen is going to boom. So this could very much be a situation where the effects of chaos, either through terraforming physically, terraforming genetically, or the interactions of real space with chaotic magic and corruption, can change the entire tenor of a planet and make it more feasible for human beings to live, operate, and complete jobs on a place where it previously wasn't possible. Another great example is just how many Chaos worlds would starve, and I mean really would starve, if not for very ingenuitive ways of getting food. Now, the natural things that come to mind are just straight up cannibalism, but there are more intelligent ways to do this. A good example is, flesh farms, and we've gone over this before, right? You can clone certain creatures, and of course you can grow certain creatures with radiation or with chaos corruption, and then consume them. If a Grox yields you 2,000 pounds of lean meat, if I expose that Grox to, I don't know, a massive amount of warp corruption, and then chop its head off before it can become a true chaos spawn, and then I butcher it, perhaps I've doubled my meat yield. And I'm not just saying this to be fanciful, there are literal in-world examples of this that we're going to get to in a second. So, the evidence that I have for this assessment is, in the warp, you have Mendringard, and specifically Mendringard's blood forges. The idea that a planet so brutal that, from the Imperial perspective, works its population to absolute death, that is so consumptive of human life, the fact that Mendringard has been able to operate for thousands and thousands of years proves the fact that these planets have to be doing some significant heavy lifting on the warp side of things in order to have any mortal population at all. I don't care how many raids the Iron Warriors have done, and they've done plenty. I don't care how many they've done. They cannot have produced enough people to keep up with the rate of attrition that is described on Mendringard. It is brutal. And the fact that they have the ability to have undesirables, the skinless simply walking around and not forcing everyone into the forge, no matter whether they can work or not, means that they have an absolute plethora of humans, enough that they can afford to ignore some of the ones they don't like all that much. That is indicative of some ability for human life to be sustained without total reliance on external sourcing. The more important one is the one that is for real space, obviously, Garyon. Garyon has some incredible examples of how the warp and chaos interact with people on a day-to-day basis. One of the great examples is the bounty of corruption. The fact that, normally we look at chaos corruption as bad or evil or negative and it makes things worse. What about when it makes things better? So, for example, on Garyon, an agri-world, or a standard civilized / agri-world, they have a production of corn, or wheat. And normally this is in a normal small seed head thing that is produced and threshed and taken care of. The chaos corruption and genetic abominations and testings of all that kind have created these brand new species of plant, these black wheat heads that produce 10 to 20 times as many calories in the same head. And they're perfectly edible. They smell a little funny. They don't taste that great to the Imperials, but they're completely edible for humans, and they yield much more in terms of edible calories in comparison to Garyon's standard crop. This is something that doubtless the Imperium would marvel at. I'm sure they wouldn't like it because it is the result of chaotic corruption and the arch-enemies meddling in the natural world, but it's an example of how chaos doesn't always minimize resources or destroy the value of resources. Sometimes they enhance them tenfold when some acceptable amount of effort is put forward in order to do so. Another great example of how chaos, the warp, and demons interact with people in real space with Garyon is the Imperial resistance on Garyon versus the insular security of Garyon. Now, Garyon has a lot of very, very impressive security operations. They have the wire wolves, which essentially keep people from agitating in certain areas. They activate when there's too much noise or aggression in their area. They come down and they massacre a whole bunch of people. It keeps people out of public spaces. It keeps them from gathering or rioting. They have the excubators, which is of course a military police unit, which is wonderful. And then they have the sigils and glyphs system. The glyphs are these floating square boxes that make people afraid and scared and essentially just break the morale of the population. If anybody was thinking of uprising or considering improving their lot, the glyphs keep the population in line, and this is a purely magical, chaotic affectation. This is essentially like broadcasting kind of discouraging propaganda, except it is enhanced with warp power. And the sigils are even more significant. These are a warp entity, an actual creature embedded within the arm of certain accepted people that essentially controls where you're allowed to go in the city. Very much like a key card for the Imperium, these chaotic sigils are very, very difficult to spoof, and they allow certain people to get within certain areas based on how much the Chaos Forces trust them. Now, even with that, all of those restrictions, all of that insular security to protect the otherwise peaceful planet of Garyon. Again, I say peaceful, it is still a military hub, but Garyon is not under siege when this is all going on. Garyon has been in the hands of Chaos Forces for years upon years upon years, far beyond the front lines of the Imperial Crusade. It has been in the hands of Sek and his followers for a long time. And this series of security measures has been put into place, accepted, and been very successful for that entire period of time. It is only when the Imperial Resistance appears, when those forces finally organize themselves, that we see the back and forth between security, the insular society of a chaotic world in real space, and the Imperium at large. The idea that, well, the Imperials are fractious, the Imperials are seditious. The Chaos Forces know what they're doing, and they know when they're about it. They know what they have to do in order to keep the population focused, down on the grind, and actively encourage their involvement within truly chaotic society. Now, while that is certainly harsh, let's also be aware that we are still talking about a wartime economy. Now, I'm not going to say that it was entirely wartime. Let's also be real that Sek is a bit of a bastard, but it is also a good example of how much the interaction of the warp can be brought into real space, how all these security systems, which are warp and or demon and or magic based, can impact people's daily lives to such a significant degree. All right, let's go right back to it. At 7:35, I believe, yes. 7:35. Bing.
Or mine, if you're lucky for yourself as a serf farmer, as there tends to be very little in the way of actual independence on these worlds. See, within the Imperium, you have planets like agricultural worlds where the populace work sort of kind of independently of one another, where there are simply just bunches of farms producing materiel that is then bought up by a central guild and shipped into orbit, for example. On other worlds, it might be nightmarish mass mechanized farming, where everyone simply works to be a part of the cog in the machinery. But in the Imperium, there is room for both. On Chaos planets, however, it is nearly always subservience. You are not going to have an idyllic Chaos world, because idyllicism is really not in the ideology here. Because to be exalted in the eyes of the Chaos gods, you must raise yourself up. And you would, of course, desire to be exalted because you are worshipping actual gods that can bless you with stuff. They can give you signs of their favor, which will give you tremendous societal prestige. Even if you are but humble farmers on a world ran by chaos, the humble farmer with a weird glowing insignia carved into his flesh is going to be way, way more popular than any other farmer. And guess how he got that symbol? Well, you see, another farmer, he made a larger pumpkin than him at the last annual Chaos Pumpkin Growing Festival, and so, determined to never be outshone again, he wandered over to his house in the middle of night and beat his wife, children, and the farmer to death with their dog. From that point on, he always had the largest pumpkin. It didn't even matter if there were any larger pumpkins around, as everyone recognized the significance of the brightly glowing brand on his forehead. Now, that's more of a humorous example, but systems like these would inevitably lead to centralization and attempts to exert greater power. You're not going to have independent farmers. You may have serf farmers, where one powerful individual runs dozens of smaller farms, absolutely. This will then probably evolve in conflict with other major farmers, as again, it's all about rising in the eyes of your patron deities. And, a lack of motivation, of ambition, tends to not only not get you very far in a chaos hierarchy, but also tends to make you the person getting hit over the head with your own pet canine. However, this sort of competition also tends to prevent a chaos civilization of this kind to ever really advance over much. Because if you've got everybody competing tooth and nail against one another, you've basically got Orc Society at that point, where you're locked in near endless struggle. And it doesn't matter what you're struggling for, whether it be to have the greatest collection of pustules, or fucking the most slave girls, or again, beating the most farmers to death with their own canines, and so on. Your society will nevertheless be rife with constant strife. And so that, too, will be a pretty frequent part of being a Chaos civilian. However, this is still a significantly better existence than the next one.
Alrighty. Let's talk now about ideology, organization, and hierarchy. Something that I think we need to touch on very much here, because that was a lot of statements that I just had to quote and then essentially counterclaim. So, claim number 1 at 1120. You are not going to have an idyllic chaos world, that means a peaceful, beautiful place, because idyllicism, the concept of beauty, goodness, and peace, is really not in the ideology here. To those of you unfamiliar with chaos theology as a whole, or maybe who haven't experienced more of my videos on chaos, that might not seem like an objectionable phrase to you. You might be like, well, of course, chaos is evil. They're bad. Their concept of what is good in life is naturally bad. What their gods want is naturally bad. Let me be clear. I categorically reject that entire quote. It is one of the few things that when I was listening to this video the first time, I decided I need to make this review because I need to talk specifically about this concept. The idea that you can't have nice things because of chaos, or the idea that chaos is totally against the idea of peace, progress, happiness, comfort, etc. Chaos theology and worship as a whole does not remove, nor injuncture in any way, the human ability and proclivity to strive for an ideal. There is no way that chaos cultists are so detached from humanity, no matter what, I don't care how mutated you are, that they cannot concept the idea of an ideal for themselves, for society as a whole, for their god, whatever it may be. I categorically reject the idea that they are somehow cut off from the natural human ability to strive for an idyllic society. And I would certainly put forward the idea on top of that, that ideal simply changes based upon how your society worships and the external pressures that are put upon you. So, what is ideal for a demon world? Well, I would argue that ideal for a demon world is harmony. The entire population of humans, perhaps ones that were originally or generations down the lines from those who were brought into the warp or who were brought, left, created, or generated upon that world, true harmony. They've become more like demons than humans. They have developed and terraformed and changed themselves in such and such a way. And of course, their benefactors have blessed them, offered them, made concessions of their world so that the entire population as a whole functions as humans would on Earth. They take to the warp as a fish takes to water or a bird takes to air. The idea that the external pressures of the warp have simply reached equilibrium with our development as a society on a demon world, that's the ideal for them. What about a traditional chaos world? Well, naturally, a traditional chaos world would seek to advance independently, to remove the tribalism, or at least to control some aspect of their society, and to put forth that bold step that mankind has always sought for, whether it be in unification, whether it be in expansion, exploration, in experience, whether it be in just pure development. That there is an ideal. And then finally, for captured worlds, the ideal is homogenization. The idea that eventually a captured world will operate as a beautiful paradise of its own, a place where no one can touch it. They are secure, they are safe, they are protected, they are unified in belief. They are all behind the concept that first started their rebellion, their revolution, or they have been brought to the correct faith, they've been brought to the way, the passage. They've learned to accept, they've learned to live in symbiosis with the new hierarchy, which we'll be getting to eventually. So just that specific quote rubbed me raw when I first heard it, and it's rubbed me raw every single time since. But let's move on a little bit to our next claim. Quote, "There is no independence on these chaos worlds. ... It is nearly always subservience." Again, getting back to the idea of chaos is always slavery. Your society is bad because of what you worship. There are two different forms of independence, if you want to look at it like that. If you want to look at, say, the imperial farmer examples, there is still a hierarchy, there's still a structure that must be met, and there's still a threat of an external force coming and punishing you, often martially, for failing to meet the tithe. So, there are hierarchies on every single imperial world. The idea of true egalitarianism of the citizen farmer is really a fiction. Now, I'm not going to say it's a fiction in that you're not independent and you can't decide what you want to do with your land, but it certainly is a fiction saying that if you chose to do nothing with your land, there would be no consequences. Now, I'm not going to say it's too much better in chaos. If you chose not to do anything with your land, you starve or die. But in the Imperium, if you choose nothing to do with your land, you die. End of options, there are no Bs. So the hierarchy is then based upon the tithe. It is punitive. It is based upon the idea that if you fail to reach the societal, if not the legal expectations of your planet, no matter how hold-fasty or stead-holty your little farming community is, you will always be cracked down upon eventually. There's no way that you can escape because the tithe is all-consuming. The administratum is literally the most detailed function in the galaxy. End of story. Chaos independence, on the other hand, while not significantly better, it is at least more flexible than the tithe. Especially on planets where there is not so much egalitarianism in the Imperium, like those massive industrial farming worlds. I also reject the idea, again with the example of Garyon, that every single thing is just mass industrialized farming. Now, certainly there is plenty of that. There's plenty of that everywhere. It works real well. But chaos independence is built of the fact of class. The idea that you, citizen 445678, are not given a number designate 445678. You are a laborer, period. No number, no need for categorization unless you're in a very specific situation, and that chaotic independence, the ability to be looked at as a crowd, as a pool, as a group, basically gives you more freedom within it. Now, if you think about concepts like rioting, if you think about concepts like mass civil unrest, the thing that makes people do things that are unique, special, stand out from the crowd is the concept of anonymity. In the Imperium, as vast as it is, the Administratum will always be able to track you down. No matter how far away they are, no matter how close they have to get, an inquisitorial or an administrational audit can always find a person that it wants to find, as long as they're actually an Imperial citizen, the vast majority of the time. Chaos, on the other hand, oftentimes lacks that overall structure. Or, even if it has it, it might be very, very acute. There is a lord, like he said, or an overseer, or even a boss who is overseeing a smaller group of workers. It is atomized. Now, the idea of having a shitty boss or a shitty overseer or lord applies to chaos just as much as it does to the Imperium, but the idea of the administratum equivalent for chaos tracking down some random cultist or serf is just non-existence. That will not happen. Again, unless you were in a very, very specific circumstance. So, the idea of independence versus hierarchy gets very, very muddied when you cover the difference between chaos independence, the independence quote-unquote, and the truth of the administratum in the Imperium. Now, it might take the administratum a while, you might die before they find you, but they will certainly find you. Final claim for here, as far as hierarchy, organization, ideology goes, is, quote, to be exalted. In the eyes of the Chaos Gods, you must raise yourself up, ... because you are worshipping actual gods. The gods are extant, the warp is real, your gods can offer you true, genuine rewards. This is an extension. I'm not going to refute this immediately, right out of the gate. Heck, I'm not refuting any of these, I'm simply giving different perspectives on them. Keep in mind the following concepts when you hear that quote. Within most Chaos worlds, outside of the warp, there is an in-group and an out-group hierarchy, and we're going to go over that in both this video and the next one. The in-group and the out-group hierarchy are not at all similar. They are made up of different types of people, they have different types of stations and functions. They are not the same. It matters when we talk about what exaltation means, and the difference between exaltation and your position in society. Not everyone can be a chosen of the gods, quite frankly, but that doesn't mean that everyone who isn't a chosen of the gods is just dead meat. Very simply, you can only have so many chosen before you need to think about somebody being a chosen farmer, and that's just not going to work out for you. Secondly, chaos cults are able to not only reorganize, but utilize useful people when they come across them. A good example is the book Traitor General, and of course Garyon, where everything is about utilizing the Imperial structure in a positive way, taking people and using their skills as Imperials or ex-Imperials to maximize the power and the efficiency of chaotic society. Now, I'm not going to say that's a universal mantra, but to be entirely honest, most Chaos Worshippers don't have the skill, especially if they're conquering a planet, off the bat to run that planet efficiently. So, they will rely on people like in Traitor General. You'll be relying on Traitor Guardsmen. You'll be relying on Traitor PDF Officers. You'll be relying on Traitor Generals. You'll be relying on Traitor Tech Priests and Adepts. All of these things essentially require that some part of your in-group, out-group hierarchy have a place for these people. Because they can't be expendable. Even if you hate them, even if you think they're scum, even if you're loath to try and develop them into anything worth a damn, you can't just get rid of them, because without them, your society doesn't function. And as much as we like to think of chaos, or of course Arch mentioned, people think of chaos as orc society, this constant flow and cycle of self-destruction, that's not representative of mankind, nor of the mentality of a developing human civilization. Think about it at the moment. If in the 1990s, mankind had essentially decided to revert back to being Cro-Magnons hitting each other with clubs, there is no question in any of our minds that somebody or some nation would have stepped forward to develop and attempt to re-civilize society. Exactly the same will apply with chaos. They may drop the ball for a short period of time, but it is without question that somebody will follow in the most successful footsteps. So let's get back to it at 11:20.
Greetings and salutations, friends. And to the constant strife and conflict and contest, a particularly skilled dog beater will emerge and outshine all the others. Now you've got the beginnings of a larger society that might eventually go planet-wide. Now you've got an example of what happens in, say, the Sabbat worlds, where particular tribes are in control of huge planetary territories, occasionally even multiple worlds, becoming able to venture out beyond the stars to conquer other planets. The life for our example civilian is about to get a lot more restrictive, as whatever theoretical freedom one might have had as Serf Farmer number 647 on Blood Farm 582...
Again, as a reminder, I just outright disagree with this. I think that there's far more variety than what he's describing. Not to mention the logistical and complexities of what he's describing would be beyond most minor cults. But again, I'm not here to critique, I'm just here to review.
Will quickly disappear when your Serf Farmer number 567 billion, and you're nothing more than the tiniest imaginable cog in a...
I would also like to make the point of scaling issue here. 567 billion, I know we're being dramatizing and grandiose, but when we try to address things in detail, I try to address things in detail, accurate to scale.
Machine so vast, you can't even imagine it. And in return, whoever owns these planets cannot even imagine a cog as small as you either. As whatever tribe you were once a part of is now waging war on a planetary scale. Because again, chaos doesn't back down. The Chaos Gods themselves are creatures of instinct, and will always seek more. Thus they will always drive their servants to seek more. Even if a warlord seizes control over one world, that will never be enough, not in the long term. He will always want to expand and grow more powerful. Thus, he will require more resources. You simply tilling the soil with a hoe and pitchfork, like in the olden days, no longer suffices. Now, you're going to need to work in the biochemical vats, growing nutrient liquids for billion-man strong armies. And he's also going to get a lot more interested in gaining the attentions of certain powers. And guess how he intends to do that? That's correct. The wholesale sacrifice of truly tremendous numbers of people. Now, hopefully, he's a successful warlord and can get most of these sacrifices from rivaling tribes or the planets he's invading. If not, however, well, the yearly celebration of Khorne's giant penis will have to go on regardless, and you've got to kill at least 1,000 people if you want any hope of Khorne actually noticing. Not to mention as well...
Alright, let's continue on. Exaltation, expansion, and rule. Specific and very important things that I've created a nifty little chart for us at 1420. So, the claim or the issue here is one that I've kind of been building on for the entirety of this video because it is a very consistent theme both in his analysis of chaos and other people's. Generally, we have what I would call a mentality build problem. We're building concept upon concept, and it's leading us down a path. And it could be unintentional, it could be completely intentional. I don't judge either way. Again, each lens is perfectly reasonable. The process is perceived as follows. You have the first stage, elemental chaos. Bad things happening randomly on every level of society. You know, the whole, kill your neighbor, grab your thing, get this, crabs pulling each other down from a bucket. You know, one of them manages to get out and he gets pulled down, and just bad things happening at every level. There's no organization, just total chaos, your average elementary school room. Then that moves to dictatorial rule. As a result of a blessing, somebody finally gains primacy and full control, and he seizes everything and grabs all of it. And once he's in control of everything, well, of course, he's driven to immediately start his campaign for the stars, his sordid and fraught with difficulty expansion, which is all resulting from this inherent hunger, this concept that the Chaos Gods can never be satisfied, and they will never be pleased with a society, or a society can never rest until all that is in creation is destroyed and is given to the gods. This hunger drives expansion, this sordid, fraught violence across the stars. Again, Orc society. And then, finally, the cycle comes crashing down. The casualties of the crisis. Society is doomed, and it is forced to collapse and to restart, with the Imperium once more crushing everything in its way and restarting these worlds again. That's the cycle that most people see. And it's not helped by the fact that that's oftentimes how this, again, throwaway, neutral lens, enemy of the evening lore is written. I don't blame anyone for believing that. But let's look at it with a little bit of a wider view, shall we? Because this is narrow. This is narrow overall, and it's very Imperium-sided. It's very seen from the perspective of, oh, a cult has arisen. Ha ha, look at their silly traditions. Oh, look, they're murdering each other because we killed their leader. How funny. Let's go kill them all and then forget this ever happened. From the outside, it certainly does look like that. From the inside, however, we can look at some important things. Specifically, this cycle assumes a scale organization. Assumes that we're getting as big as we possibly can. Let's talk about that. The timeline is paramount in understanding why this concept, this cycle, is just flat out wrong, or is incorrectly interpreting perceived impacts on Chaos Society. As is the drivers behind Chaos Society being misunderstood here. There are pressures from the inside, similar to ones on the outside. These might include excess or lack of labor. Too many hands, not enough mouths. Too few hands, too many jobs. A lack of resources, not enough food, and not enough metal, not enough air, not enough water. All of these things push in on every type of Chaos Society, whether it's in the warp, captured, or traditional. Restrictions upon the vehemence or the opportunities for improvement of Chaotic Station. So, what does that mean? What do you mean I can't just murder everyone and become a better priest on my world? Well, number one, you might run out of people to murder. And number two, murdering people isn't always the way to get the gods' attention. And in spite of what some people believe, humans are not so insane, most of the time, that they will simply do the same stupid thing over and over and over and over again, expecting a different result. Now, humans are violent. Chaos cultists are usually also violent. And they are inherently predisposed to believe, because their gods are real, that if they receive blessings, or if they do what the gods want, they will receive blessings. Now, it would be the height of folly to just keep doing the same thing over and over again. Excess? Sure. Change and differences? Arguably more important. More of a good thing versus more good things. It's a very different mentality, but it's one that cults kind of have to cleave to, because without it, you're just going to kill out your entire society, and that's not going to be functional. At some point, the individual who's killing everybody is gonna get killed. And usually, as humans tend to learn from the mistakes of others, which is also a thing completely divorced from Chaos lore, I have no idea where this whole trend came from of, like, a civilian or a cultist just doesn't understand the flaws that the previous leader had and does the same exact stupid thing, and then are Pikachu face shocked when the same bad thing happens to them. That's not how humans generally operate. We learn, we improve, we make progress, and more importantly, we make records. That is kind of how society develops. And chaotic society, as we've mentioned, is no different from normal society, because chaotic humans are no different from normal humans, at least in terms of their mentality, psychology, and their mental proclivities and ability. Some of them are probably a little low on the IQ scale, not gonna lie, but that doesn't mean that they will repeatedly touch the oven to see if it's hot type of stupid. So, the boilerplate here, the boilerplate chaos consumes eternally, which I'm putting air quotes around for very, very good reason. The boilerplate chaos consumes eternally need not apply, and in fact does not apply to every single chaotic civilization. Now, does that mean that there are some people stuck like Tuska's Wa on an eternal cycle? They're just entertainment for the gods? Yes, I'm sure there are. I'm also 100% sure that there's a very, very small number of both worlds and people stuck in that loop. Now, again, like we've been talking about, most of these are sustained or self-sustaining populations of people. That means that development is inevitable, unless they are truly orcish in society, which again, we can confirm that they are not. We will also need to assume that they'll be able to develop over time. Now, what examples do I have? Because of course the chaos consumes eternally argument is always something that's echoed back to you whenever you make this argument. What is my example of this not being true? Gura. Gura is a wonderful example of the boilerplate chaos will always push you into this fraught and violent expansion immediately. Now you might say, well, what about the Chaos Crusade? Guys, it took 3,000 years, hundreds of generations, for Gura to become united, organized, developed, and then powerful enough, even under an extremely charismatic and powerful individual who understood the concept of hard work, collaboration, conjoint forces with the Imperium, the idea that you can't just kill all the Imperials, you need to value them in some way. Archon Nadzybar's concept of the fifth god, the idea that the mistaken faith, something that the humans need to be turned away from rather than just killed for believing in. Even with that, thousands of years needed to elapse, similar to Cultus Arcadia, before a chaotic society was driven to advance and to attack. And if you're going to say, well, Gora had no reason to expand, Gora is what's left of the sons of a great chaotic empire. They had the most vicious and visceral, brutal blood libel against the Imperium of Man, specifically against the Saint. They have the most vicious, visceral, and gut-wrenching blood libel against the Imperials, true violence incarnate, bred into their culture, and they still developed for 3,000 years independently of the Imperium without that boilerplate drive forcing them off-world in some sort of insane death charge. They are capable of developing, they are capable of being independently governed by chaos without simply falling apart, and most importantly, that boilerplate chaos consumes eternally does not have to apply to every single chaotic civilization. I think the most important part of what your civilization is for is basically, why was it formed? And if you're going to say, well, if it's a violent reason, then of course chaos consumes. Well, Nadzybar forms first the Gower under him, but then of course the rest of his planet unified as one, and takes them into the stars, using help that they could have accessed. It's not like not having access to spacecraft personally limited them. Spacecraft did land on Gura, and we know that. There's visitations and trade going on, so we know they could have taken a ship and taken to the stars in a massive death charge if they truly felt driven by the Chaos Gods, but they never did. So clearly that boilerplate does not apply to them. Nor then does it have to apply to every single cult in the way that people seem to believe it does. It is not a boilerplate. It is simply a label slapped on to avoid the deeper understanding of why cults do things, why they develop, and how they develop over time. It is essentially a cop-out to avoid the legwork required in creating something like this. Now, speaking of in-group, out-group hierarchy, as I'm going to go into detail here, let's just talk about sustained logistics for a minute. In order to, again, have that self-sustaining population that completes a goal on whatever planet it may be, you need to have logical and consistent logistics. Now, they can be bad. You can have logical and consistent logistics and have them be bad, but you can't expect your society to function if you're expecting a shipment of wood and a bunch of rubber shows up. Now, that might be a mistake, but if that's every single time and that's how the system's set up because the person who created it is an absolute mouth breather, well, that's just not going to function. So we can assume that whatever system uses that unsustainable logistical system, whether it be human sacrifice, food, or production, will never reach the level of an organized cult. I mean, obviously they're going to change and evolve as Chaos Society does to develop further, but logistics is another hard cap, essentially, where you gotta figure this out, and it's not like you lose that knowledge once you go into the rest of the galaxy. You bring your logistics network with you. Now, again, it does not have to be robust, it does not have to be impressive, but it does have to be extant if you are a well-organized cult. Or if you're really a cult at all. Because in order to unify a planet, you must needs have some level of logistical support and control. Now, let's talk about this in-group, out-group hierarchy. Let's go up both sides here. At the very top of the pyramid, you have the Chaos Gods. And as we go down each side, on the left side, we have the in-group. Now, I've put cult/tribe as the in-group. These are the people who, no matter the planet, are the core. They are the center. They are the knowers. They are the believers. They're the people who came, or the people who were, or the people who are on top of society and worship chaos. Now, why did I put tribe in addition to cult? Cult is obvious, right? The cult conquerors, the cult warband conquerors. What does tribe have to do with anything? Tribe has to do with both the traditional worlds, and it has to do with disparate tribes on demon worlds. Now, we've heard Arch talk several times about, well, what if you're a Nurgle group, or what if you're on this village, or you're disparate. Tribes will eventually, similar to Gora, gain control of or organize some way to affect demon worlds in the same way that they would worlds in reality. Now, it may take longer, it may be a lot harder, it may require a little bit more finagling, but it will happen in the end, and that means there will be one dominant tribe on those worlds, the same way that there will be a dominant cult on a cult world. And on the other side, we have the outgroup. The outgroup is Imperials and ex-Imperials. Now, why have I put here elevation based on merit and pseudo-merit? This entire hierarchy is focused upon how to best optimize the combination of in-group, cult and tribe, and out-group, imperial. How is it based? How do we judge who in the out-group gets to advance, who in the in-group is at the top? Well, in-group is fairly simple, right? It's the basic hierarchy that we've already gone over. Your demagogues, your chosen at the very top, and at the bottom, your civilians, and then the outcasts, the individuals who don't belong in your chaotic society and yet are born into it. The same thing applies with the out-group, except while the chaos group is based upon merit, what you can offer versus what you cost, the out group is based upon pseudo-merit. Pseudo-merit is the idea that you must pass a twofold test. First, you must be worth something. You must have value. You must bring some skill or talent or ability not currently available to the cult or the tribe that makes up the in-group. And secondly, you must accept God. You must accept and understand the idea that the chaos gods are the ones leading you now. Now, it can be completely performative, or it can be at least partially understood. But let's go down the lines here. Right below God, you have the cult demagogues and the chaos chosen, whoever that may be. Usually it's Space Marines. On the other side, for the outgroup, you have the pivotal Imperials. Pivotal Imperials include things like planetary governors. They include individuals like major Imperial Guard generals. For example, Van Voigt comes to mind, Dravir comes to mind. If any of them had ended up in the hands of Chaos and been converted, they would be considered pivotal Imperials. Their merit is incredible, and if only they could be turned to the right path in terms of religion, they would be right up there with the demagogues and the chosen. Now you might say, well, they're still a slave, they're still seen as inferior, right? It's about position, and it's about privilege. This out-group, in-group mentality still remains. There's still a solid line between the pivotal Imperial and the demagogue, but while he may not be a lieutenant, a pivotal Imperial certainly is going to be respected and given far, far more freedom, access, availability of resources, etc., than he would be if he was not so important and not so converted. Now, as you go up the pyramid, the more and more purity testing you're going to get as far as how true your faith is, but beyond simple loyalty, pseudo-merit matters a lot more. So, level below them, on the Chaos side, on the in-group side, you have Space Marines, your diehards, your bodyguards of the Demagogue, etc., your Chaotic Priest, and those related to the Chaotic Priest. So those individuals who help the people above them to connect directly with the warp. On the other side, you have Imperials of value. Tech Priests, Imperial officials, officers of the Imperial Guard, officers of the PDF, individuals who can't quite affect the entire planet, but my goodness, do the skills that they bring to the table offer so much to the cult. Now, immediately you might be saying, oh, how are you going to convert these people? How are you going to first? A lot of these people will convert willingly or because they have no other choice. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to be diehard Chaos worshippers loyal to the flag, sitting down and slashing themselves to the insignia, but once they profess, the narrow wedge of chaos does the rest. And the corruption that sets in these people, within a few decades essentially, will make do what indoctrination and torture generally won't. Unless they are part of the outgroup threats, which we'll talk about in a bit. Below both of them, we have the large warrior class for chaos. Specifically, that is your acolytes who are loyal to the gods, and then the cultists who are loyal to survival. They're essentially loyal to whoever will feed, arm, protect to them, etc., provide them with privileges. Whereas the acolytes are far more indoctrinated. Not quite so much as the diehards, but just a little bit less. On the other side, on the outgroup side, we have the converted. Essentially, these are the quote-unquote traitors, so standard line traitor guardsmen, your various scapegoats, so the people who helped you during the uprising, those, converted people who maybe didn't realize who they were helping, and, oh, now it's time, I guess I have to switch hats, because, uh-oh, maybe if the Imperials do win, I might get killed. Those scapegoats, those yellow bellies, the people with no spine, who you end up turning because they're cowards, House Gentethi, for example, those individuals are going to be part of this class below the valuable Imperials, but still above the average civilian. Now, what actual privileges does that provide them? Not much, but it provides them the ability to essentially have similar barracks and supplies, etc., to a standard soldier within the in-group. Now, treating them as a soldier, are they treated as soldiers? Well, it depends. We also have the traitor guards, and we have civil discipline groups and overseers. These are actual discipline troops. They're designed to work like Arbites or riot troops or PDF. They're trusted to take care of their own people. So, for example, it's often a common statement that once the federal officers show up to a local crime scene, the local police department don't really get along with them. That is because the locals know their community. They know the people inside of it. They know that Jerry gets drunk on a bench every now and then. They know that they have to drive this lady down because she has heart palpitations. That local knowledge is invaluable. And it's one of the reasons why cults go out of their way to try and cultivate these converted people, because most people, when they think of cultists, they just think, get rid of everyone who's a civil defense trooper, get rid of all the people who were overseers. They're loyal to the Imperium. They're going to mess with our stuff. Guys, they can offer you remarkable insight into the society. And we know, again from Garyon, but also from other Imperial worlds, that many of them are willing to trade the hat, swap over the boots, switch a couple icons, and wear the opposite side's colors if it means possibly securing themselves a better lives, and, more importantly, a lot of the time, securing the population they represent a better life. And this helps you in your transitional period, when you're not all 100% on the Chaos train, but people are climbing up the ladder and the outgroup threat group is getting smaller and smaller. These people are really the conversion point. They're the individuals who are really going to start getting into the in-group once society has stabilized. Below them, we have civilians on both sides. We have the cult civilians. They are the transfers to this planet, or the core tribe. They're neither gifted nor blamed. They are more so liberated from their previous existence. Why do I say that? Because cult civilians on a planet or on a world that has become chaos-controlled or has been unified so that the in-group is now on top and this hierarchy can form, inherently they're going to receive basically preferential treatment, which is great for them. It's certainly an improvement. Maybe not a significant one, but it is still an improvement for them. The Imperial civilians, on the other hand, I refer to as the ignored. They are, when I go back to that idea of a pool, the faceless worker, the ignored, the mass ordered, the chained, the pool, those fresh to society, not yet in another class or camp. I do have to mention that these guys are often very seditious, due to the fact that they receive almost no consideration. They don't really have a skill. They're not really even to the level of the lowest cultist. They're still considered unreliable. Perhaps as laborers, but again, the idea of the chained, the ignored. Perhaps they get left out and they're just grabbed every now and then to do some basic day labor work. All of that stuff drives Imperial civilians into one of two camps. They either try and gain a skill or an ability to become one of the converted, or they become part of the threats, the outgroup. Now, in terms of the in-group's outcasts, you have individuals who are not part of the tribe, not military, not related to the priesthood or to the chosen. So that can be other tribes, that can be tag-alongs with the cult, it can be disaffected cultists. All of these groups are essentially stewing around with the Imperial civilians. Now, they can also be seditious and problematic, but there is one group that's even worse than both of them for your society. The outgroup threats. These are the people that are either too hard to mentally break or convert, or they have skills, intelligence, etc. that they're intentionally withholding, and and as a result of that, they are an ever-dwindling group on that outgroup threat. They are going to be the constant target of culls, of retaliation attacks, of enforcement squads. All of this is going to result in that outgroup threat being the group that disappears the quickest, essentially. So those forces are all going to be functioning on this large two-sided hierarchy that, again, is based on merit on the side of the in-group. They're all focused on getting closer to God, or pseudo-merit on the side of the Imperials. You need to be useful in order to get noticed, and you need to convert in order to be accepted. Now, does a little bit of stink cling to you of being an Imperial? Yes. But, again, we're not in Orc society. We're aware of the concept that people can change and improve. Garyon is an example of this. Many of the people who are in the Garyon resistance are actually pretending to be part of the converted. The accepted, in that case, from that book, Trader General. But it just goes to show that the Imperial civilians can be quite seditious. And even as Chaos tries to accept and improve these people and give them their pseudo-merit status, there's still going to be some worry there, which is again why disciplined troops and overseers are needed. So, that was a long one. Let's get back to our very last one, and that one is at 1420.
Greetings and salutations.
Pause for a sec. 1420. There we go. So, we got two more.
Civilizations had the fascinating habit of murdering various animals to read the future in their entrails. I am happy to inform you that the Chaos Worshippers have much the same ideas, except, they tend to use people instead. And you're lucky if you're in a cornered world and all they do is chop your head off, because believe you me, there are actually worse ways to be sacrificed to the demon gods. This, however, does also open up a lot more possibilities for civilian life, as now we've got to talk about something to do with logistics, my favorite topic. Because a lot of settings that do the whole evil civilization thing often forget about one simple fact. If you do indeed need to carry out enormous gladiatorial contests with vast quantities of human sacrifices in order to keep the sun rising and so on, where are you going to get all of the people from? If you're killing them by the thousands on the daily, as we hear in the description of certain Chaos worlds, well, you're gonna run out of people eventually. And worse still, you're going to run out of a labor pool. As we humans are damnably inconvenient in this regard, as it takes a good 10, 12, 14 years before we grow to a size where we'll really be all that useful as workers. And let's not even get started on the public order problems you might have with stuff like this. Okay, you've lived your entire life for a Chaos world. You genuinely do believe that the gods are real and that they're out there and they require sacrifice. Fair enough. That will certainly give you a decent reason to be able to put up with the constant human sacrifices. But at some point, a large group of people are going to go, but why us? Can't it be the people over there? And they're going to decide to start doing something about it. Civilizations based entirely on human sacrifice tend to be rather unstable, due to the innate dissatisfaction that people will have with being fucking killed. Unless the entire population is 1000% indoctrinated, which is theoretically possible on, say, a Slanesh world, for example, with hypnosis or drugs, or an Nurgle world with various plagues that you can't escape them anyway, so why bother? But it is going to require a fairly stern hand on the rudder to keep the populace quiescent when you're killing them by the thousands every day, especially if you don't get any signs or signifiers that it was actually worth it. As an example from our own world would be the Aztecs and how incredibly unpopular they made themselves with everybody else around them. So, in reality, if you want a functional Chaos society capable of feeding resources and new conscripts into a war machine large enough to conquer other planets, you are actually going to have a fairly structured society. You are going to have farmers. You are going to have tradesmen, businessmen. You're probably going to have bankers and clerks and various other things as well. You're going to have bureaucrats. Somebody's got to oversee the blood harvests. Somebody's got to manage all of the countless pleasure palaces. Somebody's got to count the poxes, etc.
I think we're beginning to see now a little bit of what I was saying about conflation, and we're going to get to the Aztec Empire right now, but you just saw there how it went back and forth, right? First, Chaos Society is chaotic, inherently destructive, goes in a cycle, destroys itself, completely falls apart, the logistics don't work, and then, well, society has to be organized in some way, right? So, I'm just cutting out a little bit of that and going straight to how it's organized. Sorry. Again, not a critique, just a review, trying to give a perspective here. So, Aztec Empire. Let's go through sacrifice, shall we? 1805. Comparing all chaos civilizations to a chaos empire. This is the big problem. Civilization does not equal empire. AKA, if it's organized, it has to be large enough to support itself. Now, that applies with like imperial worlds or with rebellions. We've already gone over how the warp and chaos can be used to shift the numerical advantage of reality towards itself, or unreality in the case of the warp. The prime issue with this analogy of a direct comparison of the Aztecs is the Aztecs were not just hated because of their traditions, like chaos is, regardless of any human sacrifice. The Aztecs weren't just hated because of that. They were hated because of their successes at conquest, and they were despised by the conquered peoples, be it tribes, or by the imperial citizens who are going to be conquered by our chaos forces. So, is the problem more that the Aztecs were killing people and ripping their hearts out by a certain number, or that they had control over a dozen separate, basically countries or tribes around them that they lorded over and demanded tribute from? This is a good question. I would argue the latter is more accurate and applies to chaos as well. So, adjustment questions. Let's answer these in rapid fire. Consider important aspects of sacrifice. What makes a good sacrifice? That's a good question. Now, this is always something that I get. Is it more worth it to sacrifice an Imperial than it is to sacrifice a Chaos Worshipper? I would say depends entirely on how prepared and how emotionally close that sacrifice is to you and the gods. You sacrifice somebody real close to you as a demagogue, that is worth a lot in terms of emotional pain that you're essentially releasing along with its soul. Now, another good question is, well, does it have to be young, healthy, happy people? If I sacrifice a cancer patient, does that make a difference in the sacrifice? What makes a good sacrifice? Well, let's say another question. Is it easy to acquire sacrifices? I would say yes. Now, you could argue that population is a problem, especially on chaotic worlds, but if you're a captured world, maybe even if you're a demonic world that can produce its population relatively quickly, or maybe you can sacrifice something else, or you constantly get Imperials who aren't really feeling all that well and they're down on their luck and perhaps they need to be gotten rid of because they can't work anymore, that's an easy way to acquire sacrifices. But generally, you might have to prepare them. Again, we come back to what makes a good sacrifice. Does their physical condition matter? Does what they worship matter? Is a chaos worshipper worth more or less than a loyalist? I would argue that a loyalist is probably worth more than most chaos worshippers, possibly one of the reasons for such inflated numbers in terms of just chopping off your own men's heads, but again, the same learn from your mistake things apply. Don't do the same stupid thing over and over again and expect a different result if you're, an actual human. Whom is it unsafe or infeasible to sacrifice long term? This brings up a very important question. Can I sacrifice the infirm, the elderly, and those unable to work, or unwilling to work? It's a good question. In chaotic society, where survival, work for bread, is one of the most important parts, especially on a captured world, what do I do with the old, the infirm, and those unwilling or unable to perform? Well, I cannot provide for them because I'm strapped for resources as it is, especially if I've been blockaded by the Imperium. What use for, then, have they? They're not converted, they're not considered of value enough to keep around like the in-group tribe. They are, in fact, probably the most seditious of civilians or out-group outcasts. So, therefore, they would make some of the best sacrifices. Now, again, I don't necessarily think that you have to be a hale, healthy, and hearty man in order to have your head chopped off for corn. Now, I think that if you're doing specifically corn, you might want to drop them into a gladiatorial arena with a few hundred of their friends and have them kill each other. That might be a little bit more tasty, but, at the end of the day, a head is a head is a head. And I'm sure that as long as you didn't take it by cowardice or by weakness, it would be a perfectly acceptable sacrifice. And of course, stick a weapon in their hand and throw them at an Astartes, and technically, I guess Khorne doesn't give a damn according to the lore. But that can vary. So I'm not going to harp on that too long, but I just like to bring up the point of work until you're dead. It could more accurately be said, work until you're ready for sacrifice. That also may apply to cultists. I severely doubt that cultists get to die a natural death of, being surrounded by their friends and dying of old age. Number one, I doubt a cultist would want that. Who would want to go to the gods in that type of situation? But naturally, they would be like, yeah, heck yeah, sacrifice me, take me, elevate me. My soul's going directly to my god. I'm going to offer it in the same way that an Imperial offers prayers to the Emperor upon their death, hoping that they will flee to his side. A cultist or an acolyte would certainly do the same for their Chaos God, and unlike the Loyalists, the Chaos Worshipper actually gets his wish when he dies. So, who's it unsafe to unfeasible to sacrifice long-term? I would say your young, effective workforce and your warriors. Those are the ones I would stay away from. Why does Chaos not always have to be an empire in order to self-sustain? Well, one, you can keep your numbers low. That whole economy of scale concept, the idea that you always have to be expanding because the glut of the Chaos Gods is infinite, we've already talked about how that is at least misrepresentative, possibly completely non-applicable. So the idea of keeping your society small, keeping your number of soldiers especially relatively small, and keeping the rest of your population focused on producing food, producing equipment, producing items, fuel, all of that economic stuff, and then maintaining enough of a military to keep society running, well, that's a very long self-sustaining strategy that will eventually develop into more and more, essentially, bumper efficiency as you achieve the minor scale improvements year upon year upon year, especially as chaos sets in, and those minor improvements, terraforming, genetics, etc., continue to drift in your favor. This all brings about a question. Unlike the Aztecs, can there be soft-handed chaos? Can you have a chaos invasion or conquest or dictatorship or organized set of tribehoods or even a demon world that is soft on its civilians, that is relatively inoppressive, that doesn't peer into the everyday lives of the civilian and doesn't necessarily affect their every single moment of every single day? I say that inside of the warp, this is relatively hard to do. Outside of the warp, a soft or a hybrid chaos regime is not only doable, with a little bit of cajiggering, but also highly profitable. And we have many examples here. Verven Hive is a great one because we have the Zoikins, who are a hive that is taken over by chaos. They are completely corrupted, very heavily corrupted, including some officials of other hives being corrupted, and nobody notices a thing until war breaks upon them on Vervenhive. Geryon, we've already been over it several times. The population is mollified, they are subservient, they are working, they are attempting in some ways to integrate with the population, they are trying to integrate as many Imperials as they possibly can to improve society. Again, they're not going out and death squatting people until the actual revolutionaries show up and start trying to make shit happen. For the Imperium, that is. Urdesh, we have House Gentethi, a wonderful example of a minor noble on a Forge world choosing to side with the Sanguinary Brood, Chaos essentially, saying that he's going to side with them because, well, the Imperials aren't going to offer him nearly as much in terms of personal, essentially, reward for his actions. So, playing the numbers on a planet like that and actually negotiating with people rather than putting a gun to the back of their head and saying serve or die, that's also soft or hybrid chaos. You're working with people, you're trying to create a functioning society rather than just chopping heads off. Anothis is another example. We have large portions of the population put to work on massive projects. Now, Anothis is a bit of a different example, specifically because there's been so much terraforming on the planet that it has actually started to affect people's daily lives, but that's not to say that it's really the fault of the chaotic administration. That's a result of their actions for sure, but it is certainly done with the attempted goal to try and integrate more people in. Obviously, if a bunch of people are fishing in order to have their livelihood and they're avoiding service with chaos, drain the entire ocean and they're no longer able to resist orders because, well, now they can't get food from the ocean. Brutal, but effective as a hybrid chaos world. Ajax Cardinal is another one. It's a planet where chaotic forces have piggybacked or parasitized onto a revolutionary movement, and they've turned it into a planet-wide war where they are continually getting more and more resources and holding and taking more ground against their enemies. In this way, AX Cardinal, again, is a soft or hybrid chaos regime. The people in charge of society might not be out-and-out chaos worshippers, but they are certainly doing the job of chaos, and they are being assisted by the archenemy. So, very, very important thing to note that the Aztec example doesn't necessarily gel one-to-one, but it brings up some very important questions, especially about sacrifice and about regime change for chaos. Now, onto our very last section. And it is at minute 28.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more of Warhammer 40k lore. The Chaos-held worlds is again, Chaos planets needs an economy. They need water, they need crops to keep functioning. But your world isn't a proper Chaos world now, is it? Or giant beasts that devour entire mountains, spitting out their resources to be transported off-world. Or simply just, raided the good old-fashioned way, moved up into orbit, and then dispatched to wherever needs it. These planets' populations are not sacred. They will be worked until they die because they are unholy. They are anathema to Chaos's cause. They are not worthy of preservation, and they will serve a far higher purpose as slaves and as sacrifices than they ever could as a labor pool. Best case scenario for the planet is that eventually the labor pool, once exhausted, will be replenished by outworld slaves, and the planet might then eventually also become a proper occupied Chaos world, but for the original populace, you're just dead. You're either worked to death, or sacrificed, or fed into a machine somewhere, or used as spare parts. Life on such a Chaos world, in such a role, will be excessively cruel and mercifully short.
Oh, you'd love to end it on that. Let us continue to our final slide, examining this for our post-conclusion, just going over that last little thing. So, some reservations that I had in making this video. I don't like critiques. I don't like critics. I don't like any of that. I hate to do it. I really dislike it. Like I said, it was only 2 or 3 lines in this video that really made me to commit to, okay, we have to do this, because these are things that I want to address, because the information that I have, basically, I needed to share before it basically burned a hole through my brain. I myself try and keep my tones on almost everything, especially within the community, as neutral as possible, because omniscience is not a gift of mine. I don't know everything. I theorize. Hell, I theorize probably more than what's good for me. But I still have to build off of what is available. And what is available to me is different from what is available to someone like Arch, who does that for his whole job. That's his whole life. He's been doing this for much longer than I do. He's the one who basically got me into a whole bunch of the hobby. Way, way back in the day, years ago. But still, it's not a gift of mine. I cannot critique someone who has so much more accolades than I do. As much as the community is certainly split on the man, and I myself am certainly not a regular viewer anymore, it's when things like this come across my radar and I get, Chaos Worlds are, Chaos Cults, and I listen and I'm like, I gotta make a comment on this specifically or on that specifically. Again, I'm not trying to do a critique. And I have several compliments. The first one is, this is a fun subject, and it plays very much into the hyper-niche fun stuff that people thirst after with lore videos. Both Arch's, and I hope to a lesser extent mine. It's one of the reasons why I decided to make this a members-only video is, I wanted to give you guys the best of what I possibly have to offer. But the other compliment I have is that this is exhaustive. This is very well done by Arch. Even though this is the shorter of his 2 civilian videos, it leaves very little out. He does smooth over quite a few things, and of course his dramatization is not my style. I'm far more on the analytical, very logical, specific side, or I don't want to say that like it's a compliment, but on the more minutia side of things. But as a true dervish with his tones and with his explanations of things, so to speak, his exaggerations and such, his anecdotes, etc., those are all great, and they work really well for this video. I do like it a lot. I still have this video. I still like this video. But I am still having to make this because there are things that I disagree with. Now, a first admission is that we're assuming that planets don't just cleave to the imperial norm. which I've already talked about, right? It's the idea of changing the hat. It's the idea of, well, the Chaos Forces just embed themselves as the new PDF and the new planetary government, and everything else on the planet runs exactly the same as normal. Now, this could be a revolutionary group. This could be a Zechian cult that just wants to take over society, but cleaving to the Imperial norm pretty much bypasses a lot of the things that both Arch and myself talked about. If you just replace the administration with you, and you don't make any major changes, hell, you keep Emperor worship to a degree, if you just leave it like that and you quietly worship chaos in your own way, at least until you show your colors, you're pretty much good. And nobody's really going to bother you unless an Inquisitor shows up by accident and sees how messed up you are inside. The other obvious admission is I am horribly biased. This is my subject. Chaos cults and chaos in general, theology, etc. is my thing. I am the Archon. I can discuss many of these things, including many of these primary sources, from my perspective, my literal perspective from the actual crusade that I took part in. So I can look at things from that perspective with my experience and my knowledge and look at all the things that are mentioned and point out things that are either not consistent, inconsistent, or have changed, or perhaps have outliers that are not necessarily seen as universal, even though to an outsider, to an Imperial, to another person making the same exact video, it might not occur to. Now, in part 2, I want to expand heavily on this. Specifically, I want to go through all the categorization, all the different types of organization, how you change things, how the labor pool changes, how your structure of society changes. I really want to go through, let's go through like 2 or 3 worlds and figure out what happens when X or Y cult. I haven't even got into warband cults. I haven't got into demons on Imperial worlds all that much. I haven't gone into different types of cults. What about death cults? What about assassin cults? What about people who really do just turn the other cheek and cleave to the Imperial norm in totality? How do Zechian cults tend to do these changes? How does it look for coronate cults? How does it look for hybrid cults or for undivided cults? How do the different Space Marine legions choose to take over a world? All of these things are very different. All of these things, I hope, will be included in the part 2 to this video. And of course, why the hell is this a members-only video? Why was this a members-only video if you're watching it as a non-member a couple of months later, or maybe a month or so later? Why is it members-only? Well, it's at least for a few weeks to avoid 2 things. One, some people in the Discord were specifically worried about this video in particular. They were asking like, hey, it's Arch, not necessarily comfortable with him in the community. A lot of people don't like him. I am entirely non-opinionated. I don't care. I don't watch his stuff anymore. I also don't watch any of his other material. I just occasionally get videos like this, and I chose to comment on this one because, well, I certainly do like this perspective, and I wanted to make my comments upon it. But that's one of the primary reasons, is that it is Arch, and Arch draws heat. And for my first collaboration / critique, or, no, God, it's not a critique, review of somebody else's content, kind of shoot high or go home, right? Don't come to the man if you're gonna miss. So I wanted to make it private to begin with, not only to respect his upload schedule, because of course he did this more than a month ago essentially, so I want to give him as much time to get as many views from his video before my tiny minuscule channel steals 2 viewers from him. But I don't want it to be in any way construed in that way. And of course, full credit is going to him. I'm going to put as much creditation as I possibly can in the video. Everything that I can possibly do. Obviously, it says his name initially, so it is part of that. His video is clearly the central portion of this video, but obviously, my commentary makes up the vast majority of the runtime, and I hope that that will count as fair use. In the meantime, I guess I can just sit and let the members watch it, and then once the brigades are done, and once the people who don't like the video have made their thoughts apparent, and whether or not I should even make this public, which of course is still up in the hands of the members and of the people on our Discord. It will be available on the Discord as well, hopefully, if I can get it there. But with all that said, it will not be members only forever. But for those members that we do have, I do want to reward you for your kindness in joining us. So, again, note, this is not a critique, and it is a very theory-heavy video. A lot of heady things I'm throwing at you, one after another, and it is a long one, so congratulations if you made it to the end. Credit, of course, goes to GW, along with Arch, formerly Arch Warhammer. Wonderful YouTuber, go check out his stuff. Alexander Elishev, Alexander Shukin, Robbie Carter, Dmitry Bushray, Damir Sajir, Yoshoka, I Am Factor, Diego Gilbert Lorenz, Sarp Kebi. I hope that you all enjoyed. The part 2 for non-members with all the Chaos of Worlds videos are incoming. And I wish you all a lovely good night.